argued that New York was in a state of transformation, and the underlying question was what kind of city it would be in the future. In an interview that he gave about whether New York should think of encouraging casinos as a solution to its revenue problems, he said, "It is still something I think we should look at in the context of what kind of city are we going to have 10, 15 years from now? Is it going to be a manufacturing city, a service city, an entertainment city, a leisure time city, a communication city?" He spoke of New York's, quote, "incomparable assets as a center of finance, entertainment, culture, communications, and international trade." And he described the need to make the city a tourist mecca for the rest of the country and also appeal to European tourists who view, as he put it, who view with alarm the leftward drift of their respective governments. This time around, New York City should look to Europe and say, "Give me your rich." The businessmen who advised Beam and the city government insisted they did not want to see services cut excessively, that it would be possible to increase productivity while maintaining service levels. One plan floated at the time was the idea of turning the sanitation department into a privately owned employee cooperative. But at the same time, I think while the contest was not necessarily over the existence of the state, these are not kind of anti-government ideologues, it was clearly over its role. And what do you use the state to do? Do you use the government? What kinds of services do you provide, and in whose interests? The problems of New York were indeed being fiercely debated in the national press. Over the course of the summer of 1975, the crisis became an opportunity for a kind of referendum on the problems of American cities and the nature of the welfare state. The city was repeatedly compared to a bankrupt corporation. As the St. Louis Post-Dispatch put it, New York City, the financial capital of the nation if not the world, is on the verge of bankruptcy. Unlike a company that goes broke and whose assets are sold off to pay creditors, New York will presumably not be put on the auction block. After all, who would buy it? The Washington Post mocked the myth, quote, "so deeply embedded in New York's politics that things are free if government provides them." The Miami Herald compared New York City to, quote, "a drunk in the family who loses most of his paycheck on the way home every Friday," citing the, quote, "million people on welfare in the city and the city's insistence on clinging to free tuition at CUNY." The Chicago Tribune attacked the city's public sector unions, saying that they had been carving their pounds of flesh out of the city's emaciated body for years. The Baltimore Sun made, kind of hovering in the background of many of these, was clearly a sense that the problems of New York were not distinct to New York, that they might affect other cities as well, or even be that New York might be a microcosm for the national government. The Baltimore Sun made the comparison to the federal government explicit. "The day may come," the editorial page wrote, "when the federal government will face a crisis similar to the one New York faces now, and no government will be able to bail Uncle Sam out." At the same time, newspapers reflected the idea the city should not simply be allowed to go bankrupt, and made the case that this could have dire consequences for the country as a whole. The Boston Globe suggested there was nothing so distinctive about New York's situation, saying that problems are not so different from those of other big cities. It's simply suffering them earlier and harder. The Washington Post ultimately came to recommend some kind of federal aid for the city, saying that unless the government was willing to act as a lender of last resort, the entire municipal and state bond market might collapse. Even the Baltimore Sun wrote that the consequences of a New York City bankruptcy could be so harmful for other state and local governments which borrow to live that the federal government has some responsibility here. In September of 1975, New York State's government created a new emergency financial control board with the power to review city budgets and guarantee that the city was progressing towards a balanced budget. This was kind of a shift of power upwards out of the mayor's office to the state level. But despite the creation of the EFCB, bankruptcy became an openly discussed subject in New York over the fall months. And indeed, in the middle of October 1975, at one moment of especially high drama, when the teachers' union briefly sought to withdraw from an earlier commitment it had made to purchase city debt with the retirement accounts of its members, it appeared the city might in fact have to declare bankruptcy. Inner circles of Beam's advisors held meetings to discuss questions such as, quote, "should default be postponed as long as possible and at all costs, advantages and disadvantages available to the city in default." The city tried to forecast potential problems that bankruptcy might pose to safety and public order, and whether there would be some way to deal with hardship cases. It imagined the hundreds of thousands of creditors who would sue the city in the event of default. It is not difficult, wrote one lawyer advising the city, to envision initial creditors' meetings being held in Shea Stadium. A bankruptcy petition, which was never filed, was drawn up and signed by a judge, and it actually hangs on the wall of a small conference room at a New York City law firm to this day. Over this time, some of the city's politicians actually began to argue in favor of default. Peter ODwyer, for example, the president of the city council, argued that the MAC, the Municipal Assistance Corporation-led reforms, were simply too socially destructive, and that the city should instead just declare bankruptcy. He said, "I do not see default as a sign of disaster, rather do I see it as an opportunity to face reality, and with time provided to us by the court to set our house in order." The borough presidents of Manhattan and the Bronx, along with ODwyer, argued that the real problem was New York's dependence on out-of-town capital, which placed, quote, the very survival of New York City as a viable unit of government at the whim of distant investors in an already oversaturated municipal bond market. And they suggested using the city's taxing authority to levy a special fund on banks and insurance companies and essentially require that they purchase city bonds. He said, "We must act like a government, not a beggar in search of funds." The Municipal Labor Committee, a coalition of city unions, criticized the cutbacks and their impact on the city, saying that the, quote, the fiscal crisis is far less dangerous than the social crisis confronting New York City. Kenneth Galbraith, the kind of left liberal economist, suggested that bankruptcy might be preferable to the city than the service cuts that were required to balance the budget. However, these kind of left advocates of bankruptcy never had real traction in the city. At the federal level, the federal government was initially and famously quite hostile to New York City, and actually, I think, also really embraced the possibility of bankruptcy as there was a sense within the Ford administration that bankruptcy would not cause dramatic, it wouldn't be kind of economically disastrous for the country. And Alan Greenspan, who was the president of Ford's Council of Economic Advisors, really made the case to the president that a bankruptcy in New York might be difficult, but it wouldn't be disastrous for the nation. Most people know about this mostly through the famous headline, "Ford to New York, drop dead," which followed a speech that Ford gave, at which I think some people anticipated. It was kind of his major speech addressing the New York problem at the end of October, and many people anticipated there might be some offer of federal assistance. Instead, what Ford proposed was introducing a new law that would make it possible for cities to declare bankruptcy in a more streamlined way. So in a sense, even though Ford kind of tried to distance himself from the harshness of the headline, "Ford to New York, drop dead," his clear suggestion was bankruptcy is the answer to New York's problems. Ford's press secretary compared New York to, quote, "a wayward daughter hooked on heroin. You don't give her $100 a day to support her habit, you make her go cold turkey." The federal rejection of New York was in part the result of the kind of hardline position of Treasury Secretary William Simon, as well as Greenspan and actually Donald Rumsfeld, who was Ford's chief of staff and then his defense secretary, and who was very hostile to New York from the first time this question came up. Simon was a former municipal bonds dealer himself who had worked at Salomon Brothers, but he was also a very kind of committed free market ideologue, and he definitely viewed the financial problems of the city as a harbinger of those confronting the entire country. In a speech that he gave in New York at the Economic Club in September '75, he didn't really talk about the city's crisis, but he spoke about the dangers that he felt that the country faced as a result of, he said, the visceral negative reaction that could be provoked by mention of corporate profits, capitalism, and even free enterprise. And he warned that the federal government had been living beyond its means for far too long, with the result being economic crisis. So Simon believed that default bankruptcy would not have a serious impact on the rest of the country, and that any kind of aid extended to the city would ultimately be a political and economic mistake because it would legitimate the kinds of borrowing strategies that New York had undertaken. His position was bolstered by mail he received from people around the country urging him to stick to a hard line in response to the city's difficulties. And reflecting these kinds of ideas, also the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal urged the city should declare bankruptcy. However, despite Simon and this kind of conservative pressure within the Ford administration, there was not a national or elite consensus around the denial of federal aid. And many business leaders argued that some kind of federal action was unavoidable. The city simply could not be permitted to declare bankruptcy. This would have an irrevocably negative effect on bondholders, the municipal bond markets for the entire country, and in a way, the broader image of New York and the United States in the rest of the world. If the city stops services and welfare payments, we will have riots in the streets, one executive wrote to Simon. The president of the Bank of America told the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs that the effects of a New York City default may well be grave and enduring, not only in terms of our economy and financial markets, but in the public confidence in government and loss of international prestige. Default, he said, most certainly must be averted in the national interest. And indeed, in the communist bloc, there was a kind of acute awareness of New York's ills. And the New York Times actually ran one story on kind of writing about the problems of New York in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet press. As the Times put it, Mayor Beam's name may not quite yet be a household word in the Soviet Union, but it seems to be turning up at least as often as that of President Ford. The Public Finance Committee of the Securities Industry Association, one of the lobbying groups representing the bond market, said that the default by New York City would be a financial event of the first magnitude, surpassing anything of like character since the banking holiday of 1933. The chairman of Con Edison wrote to Ford to plead with him to not let New York go bankrupt. He was, of course, partly concerned about the millions of dollars that Con Edison stood to lose from the city government. He argued that it would have wide-ranging and unpredictable financial effects, and he said that in the city's favor, Governor Carey and Mayor Beam have already placed management of the city's finances in the hands of some of the ablest business executives of the country. So instead of allowing New York to default, there was a kind of elite position that the federal government should extend aid, but do so on terms that mandated restructuring of the city government. And in November of 1975, in response to this kind of pressure, the Ford administration reversed its earlier hostility towards lending to the city and agreed to support the extension of a kind of set of seasonal loans to New York, while continuing to monitor the city's finances closely to insist that it make cutbacks and balance its budget. The city also obtained a moratorium on the repayment of its short-term debt. So simply saying that they weren't going, that they didn't, the nature of the emergency was such that they did not have to repay any of the short-term debt that they had bearing down upon them, a move that was found unconstitutional a year later. But in a sense, I think that the city never really believed that it was going to fly legally, but just wanted the time, or wanted to buy itself a little bit more time. So in a way, the pressures of the Cold War and the sense of anxiety about the economic and political image of the United States proved much stronger than the purist anti-government position in the 70s. And the federal government, instead of simply withholding aid, would be used to extend loans that had the effect of enforcing a new vision of government for the city of New York. So within the city, the sudden crisis of the government did not lead to a rise in anti-government politics. Instead, it resulted in a range of competing groups intensifying their demands on the state. And this is the last section of this talk, but I think there's a sense, an image of this crisis in New York, a legend about it, that it was this moment of unity between labor, government, and business in the city. But in fact, almost every cutback in services, closure of a firehouse or police station, or reduction in city personnel was greeted with outrage and with calls to reinstate the benefits that were threatened or had just been taken away. When daycare centers, for example, were closed in the spring of 1976, the borough president of the Bronx wrote an angry letter to Beam, which went, "We have just heard that mailograms have been received by a number of daycare centers with the opening words, 'We regret to inform you,' and telling them that they will be closed. Perhaps it is appropriate to enter the chilling telegrams sent to families of servicemen." Plans to shutter Fordham Hospital in the Bronx elicited a similarly strong response from local politicians. "We are calling on you to give us hope. Where private industry will not tread, government cannot be equally insensitive by turning its back on her poor and low-income people." Many New Yorkers made their own donations donations to the city government in the hope of rescuing it, sending along $25, $10, $2. They affirmed their need for public services. Please do not close any libraries. I cannot afford to go out and buy any book I wish to read, wrote one person. They wrote in defense of night English programs that were threatened with closure. In some cases, the people who wrote to the mayor presented themselves as a kind of beleaguered middle class, a deserving middle class whose police, fire, and sanitation services were being cut while purportedly undeserving people on welfare were still collecting benefits. As one woman wrote to Beam, our new slogan can be read as follows: come to bankrupt city, crime and filth are on the rise. Middle-class people feared that the withdrawal of public services would mean the decline of their neighborhoods. We are petrified, wrote one Queens resident. We need the 107th precinct. The feeling in the area is that the middle class is being driven out of New York. There were several different neighborhood occupations of firehouses threatened with closure. So people from the neighborhood would just literally kind of flood in and take over these firehouses. And this happened in several different places throughout the city, over 75. By far the longest such occupation was the sit-in and neighborhood mobilization at Engine Company 212 in Williamsburg, where people from the neighborhood kind of occupied this fire station, kept the fire engine there, and lived in the fire station while kind of using it as a basis for organizing different kinds of political activity for over a year. Ultimately, they rescued the fire station, which reopened as a result of this pressure. At Hostos Community College in the Bronx, students organized a major occupation of campus buildings to protest the plans to merge the newly created bilingual college with Bronx Community College. And then, of course, John Jay was threatened, was one of the campuses in the CUNY system that was slated for closure, and which was also obviously rescued thanks to different types of political organizing to keep the college open. But at the same time, even as there was this wave of activism, in other ways, the political mood within New York began to shift to the right. With the city's police force reduced and firefighters cut back, the crime rate rose and arson spread throughout the city's poor neighborhoods, and a deeper mood of anxiety and fear gripped the city. For some people, the crime wave seemed a sign of a broader cultural design. Is New York City, after all, a failed ultra-urban experiment in which people eventually crack, social order eventually collapses, and reason ultimately yields to despair, when one editorial in the New York Times read in 1977. And in 1978, the mayoralty would go to Ed Koch, who had remade himself as a conservative Democrat, committed to law and order politics and to wooing the business community to stay in New York. So even after the most acute period of fiscal crisis had passed, the legacy of retrenchment that it had inaugurated remained. And in fact, the federal government kind of had to extend a new program of loan guarantees in 1978 when fiscal crisis threatened once more. There was some way in which visions of individual self-help began to replace the older welfare state. A Citizens Committee for New York, founded in November 1975, sought to, quote, tap the potential of individual citizens, community and civic groups, the media, institutions, businesses, churches, to organize volunteer and self-help projects on behalf of the city. Army recruiters contacted New York, indicating that laid-off city workers should consider joining up with, quote, the nation's largest employer. Time and again, Beam answered the many letters that came to him just by saying the city had no money to restore programs and the fiscal crisis necessitated cutbacks at all levels. Regardless of what claims people made on it, the city government would not act as it had in the past. The remaking of the government was not to be framed as a question of the right versus the left or conservatives versus liberals. The fiscal crisis just made the old order impossible and demanded bringing about a new way of organizing the life of the city. Looking back on it 10 years later, Felix Verhaeten, the Lazard Freres investment banker, said that the crisis redefined the political dialogue here very sharply, and that it, quote, underlined in the most brutal way possible the limits of any unit of government to create money itself and promise all things to its citizens without a very solid private sector base. So in the future, he said, there would be an understanding that business has to be supported and not just tolerated. So just two final kind of concluding thoughts from all of this. The 70s, as I'm sure you've discussed, for a long time, historians sort of dismissed the 1970s, a kind of transitional moment between the exciting 60s and the 80s. But there has been this class is no accident, there has been a sort of resurgence of interest in the 1970s and the ways in which the 1970s tell us something about our present day. Historians have written about the rise of conservatism, the rise of the service economy, changes in class identity, challenges to traditional family norms, and kind of located the origins of many of these in the 1970s. I think another way of thinking about the legacy of the 70s is to see it as the birth of a kind of age of austerity, a framework of constrained horizons and a sense of impending economic scarcity, which has in some ways defined the post-1973 era as clearly as the assumptions of economic growth and mass prosperity did the post-war years. The mid-20th century has been described as a kind of consumerist republic by historian Elizabeth Cohen, in which the basic question that the country confronted was how to adjust to the meaning of mass consumption and rising standards of living. But the more recent period, in many ways, appears defined by the effort to manage economic inequality, instability, and recurrent panic, and the attempt to persuade people to accept this as necessary and to accommodate themselves to a fundamentally limited horizon of political possibility. A time of economic austerity in terms of state spending, but also, more deeply, a mood of political austerity, a contraction of political imagination that has endured even when the stock market has been the most exuberant. So I think, well, finally, I guess, the history of New York offers a new way of thinking, I think. The history of the place can offer a new lens into thinking about the nature of post-war liberalism and this shift in American political economy more generally in the late 20th century. A lot of this literature, a lot of the things that historians have written have focused on, and I've been part of this, narratives that portray the coalescence of a new free market right, gaining in confidence and power over the late 20th century. And while I think there's a lot in the story of New York that supports this view, there are also important kind of counter-narratives that run against it. The crisis became in many ways a contest over the nature and the scope of the government rather than a simple anti-government mobilization. It was so powerful precisely because the fiscal crisis revealed the actual weakness of the state and the limitations of post-war liberalism in New York, and in particular the intense reliance of these politicians on debt financing in order to achieve a social agenda. The crisis illustrated the frailty of the state, which in turn opened up New York's distinctive social sector to being dismantled. And the sight of this happening initially led to an increase in claims on these services that people felt that they had a right to. But it also made it very easy for conservative activists to advance their claims that government was inevitably weak and limited, and that meaningful social change and stability could only be provided by the private sector. The crisis changed the ideas of people and the actions of people who had previously identified themselves as liberals, as many of them came to acquiesce in and to participate in the new regime in the city. And within the city, although it didn't it didn't involve the embrace of a straightforward anti-government ideology, the crisis helped to bring in a new age of austerity, a restricted set of hopes and imaginings for public life, which would characterize much of the politics of the 80s, and which I would argue go into the present day. And finally, the public spectacle of New York in crisis helped at the national level to discredit the ideals of liberalism, while also generating a new kind of political language in which the welfare state is attacked as fiscally imprudent and irresponsible, not as a question of politics, but of simple feasibility, a framework that has endured, I would argue, until the present time. So I think I'll stop there, and I open up for questions.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm from the ISP class. It seems, and I spoke about this in a few of the other lectures, it seems that there's no oversight. We're going through the exact same thing again. Where does oversight come in so we can mitigate the risks that put us into this fiscal crisis, so we can stop?
So you're saying the same thing is happening again?
It is.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say, well, a couple of things. I mean, first, I think it's actually notable
1960 on, there have been waves of tax increases. And from that point, the city went from being maybe tax burdens maybe 10% heavier than the local average for the U.S. to like 50% heavier by the onset of the crisis and 80 to 90% heavier by 77. Because during the crisis, there was a last wave of increases that Beam himself enacted. So I think the fact that the city was relying more on debt, on short-term debt financing, came in the context of a vast expansion of its fiscal capacity. And to sort of ascribe the crisis to, oh, we just didn't have enough money, because there was an anti-tax, climate. I just don't think that works as a lead-in. I mean, certainly the idea that you couldn't keep, going back to the well forever came out of there, in not only New York City, but I think somehow what you're talking about has to have that tax story in the context as well.
That is true. And you're right that there had been great increases in taxes in the city and in the state also in the time preceding the onset of the fiscal crisis. And there may it was interesting, just today, there was a cover story in the New York Times about this idea of public libraries, that to finance the public libraries, the city should sell the land to developers who will then build new buildings, or kind of, luxury apartment towers, say, and then the bottom couple of floors will have the city library in it. And on one level, you might say this is, an ingenious way for the city library system to get the money that it needs, or something, to have repairs in some of these. But at the same time, I think it suggests a very different symbolism about what these buildings are and what they represent and who owns them and controls them and what they stand for. So I think, yeah, there's like I do think that there is a way in which austerity that political message and then the actual experience of living in a city or a country with a radically reduced public sector can open up support for fiscally conservative politicians such as Christie, or people who have put that at the center of their appeal.
No, good evening, Erling King. I'm a student. And my concern, I understand all of this, but we pay federal taxes and laws. And the federal government uses our tax dollars to fund, for instance, large corporations, the oil company. The amount of money we give to them, who are using it to pay their staff, and that's why they have so much profit, why can't we, who are the people, why can't we expect something? They expect it, and they're supposed to be on their own, but they're really not. But we should be on our own as a people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that there's a sense in which, the idea of independence is more for, that large corporations do expect and receive for various different kinds of subsidies from the government that they clearly have no problem expecting or demanding, and yet there is a way in which ordinary people don't have, or are kind of told, don't expect anything, do it for yourself. Your point about federal taxes is also a good one, in that in the 70s, many people in New York who were kind of arguing for aid for the federal government pointed out that New Yorkers pay huge amounts of tax to the federal government. So in a way, asking for aid or assistance wasn't asking for a handout or just asking for money that didn't come from anywhere. It was in a way reflecting the economic contributions that the city made to the federal government and to the nation as a whole. So that was really a point that people raised consistently, both just citizens writing letters to politicians raised this issue, and then also the kind of political leadership raised it too. So I think it's a very good point.
Nothing has changed, and the community is constantly thinking that we shouldn't ask or expect. So why are corporations expecting and still getting it? Why are they still getting it? And the people are not seeing something wrong with that picture. So people need to be told and understand where our money goes and why it's going where it's not needed. And when it's needed in the community, we must stand on our own. We should all stand on our own.
Okay, last question.
The timeline in my head is a little fuzzy, so I hope you can help me out here. When in all this time did the city income tax start, and when did the commuter tax start and then fizzle?
The city, both of them started in, I believe, under Lindsay, so in the late 1960s.
66.
Yeah, so before all of this. So yes, there is a city income tax during this period, but also commuter income tax. The commuter tax. There was a lot of debate about raising the commuter tax in particular, and a lot of resistance to raising the commuter tax. So it might have been raised. I have to check this. It might have been raised briefly at the heart of the fiscal crisis, but there was a lot of hostility towards that. And I think think if it was raised briefly, it was quickly lowered, or as soon as it could be, people backed away from that position. There's also, I mean, there were also kind of a range, like the stock transfer taxes and taxes on the financial industry, which also met with a lot of resistance, and the stock exchange lobbied against them, and different, the financial community kind of tried to prevent raising those taxes and said, we'll leave and go elsewhere. Which again, I think they may have raised, but been raised briefly, but then there was a deep sense in the city that taxes were not going to be the answer to this problem. That raising local taxes, I mean, I think this idea that, and again, like how completely, I am not sure in my own mind how much credence to give this argument, but people certainly made the argument the city is too heavily taxed, we're losing business and residents because of it, we cannot raise taxes anymore in the city, and the only way that we can get out of this is, if we raise taxes, we'll do it as little as we can, and for as short a time period we have to. The longer term way to answer this crisis is by cutting the services. So.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.